Adventures in Babysitting begins with Chris Parker, a 17-year-old high school student that's about to get ready for her anniversary date with Michael Todwell, or Mike for short. Then when Mark's car had pulled up to the Parker residence, what Chris did is that she went downstairs and then said to herself that this would be the night of her life, or so she thought. Then when she opened the door to see Mike, that's when Mike gave her the bad news. He's canceling the date of what should have been the night of their anniversary. The reason? Well, he claims his case to say that his sister is sick and that his parents will be out of town for a while. So after Chris had heard the bad news, that's when Mike left the residence. Luckily for Chris, she has her best friend Brenda to come cheer her up, but instead she just makes her feel worse. After Chris had explained to Brenda why Mike had to cancel out all of a sudden, then Brenda had told Chris that there's something off with Mike and claims her case that he may be lying to her. So although Chris tries to deny and dismiss it, and then Brenda asks her of why she's making such a big deal out of it. Well, Chris had pleaded her case with Brenda to say that Mike, according to her, is the best thing that ever happened with her. Although Brenda agrees, but then pleads her case to say Mike's the only thing that ever happened. Then Brenda just told Chris this case that lately her parents have been driving her nuts. And if she doesn't leave the house ASAP, she's going to try to do something desperate. Although supportive, Chris just told Brenda not to do that. Then Mrs. Parker, Chris's mother, comes upstairs to Chris's room to tell her the good news. She said that earlier she just got off the phone with the Andersons and wanted to know from Chris if she would babysit for them as a favor. At first, Chris just told her mother that she's not up to it because she said that she'd rather be depressed. Though Brenda, trying to be supportive as she could be, just told Chris this suggestion that if she babysits for the Andersons, it'll depress anyone. So back with Chris, now realizing that she has no choice, she follows her best friend's suggestion. So in her mother's station wagon, she heads off to the Anderson place. So in the Anderson place, we have Sarah, who's the younger sister of her older brother Brad, who's in the kitchen. And so Sarah just told her brother the good news that Chris will be stopping by. Although despite a minor accident with the macaroni after Sarah had told him this news, that's when Sarah skates off. Back with Chris, who had just left the Parker residence moments ago, she had just now had arrived at the Anderson place. So meanwhile, back with Brad in the upstairs bathroom, he just found out his Clarissa was missing thanks to his sister Sarah. Downstairs, Mrs. Anderson just meets up with Chris at the door. So after letting Chris in, Mrs. Anderson, the first thing she did was to apologize to Chris for the short notice. Although Chris forgives her and said it wasn't a problem at all and she's more than happy to help. So back with Brad and Sarah, who just came downstairs, they met up with Chris. Then Brad was nice enough to take off Chris's coat because she didn't just confess that it once belonged to her grandfather once upon a time. Mrs. Anderson, who just came downstairs from upstairs, just reprimanded Brad for falling in love with Chris. Then they all went to the kitchen. So in the kitchen, we have Mr. Anderson with Sarah. Now you're probably wondering what was the Andersons' favor from Chris? Well, Mrs. Anderson just told Chris that they're going to the Associate Center in Chicago. And of course there's some rules for Sarah. Like first of all, she's not supposed to wear skates in the house. So even though her parents agree that they'll go out for ice cream later, under one condition if Sarah doesn't stay up very late. And of course Mrs. Anderson also told Chris that Daryl, who's Brad's best friend, will be stopping by later. And of course, there's one more thing. Sarah should take her cough syrup, even though, despite the fact that Sarah's getting over a cold. So back with the Andersons, before heading off, they were told to have a good time, and of course they will. And the Andersons told everyone not to worry, that they'll be back before 1 o'clock. Long story short, now that everyone's back in the house, that's when Brad heard a knock at the back door. It's his best friend Daryl. Though Brad had declined Daryl's request to sleep at his place, though Daryl did suggest that he'll sleep at the Anderson place instead. So long story short, back with Chris, Brad, and Sarah, they were watching TV in the living room until Chris gets a phone call from Brenda at the bus station. So meanwhile at the bus station, Brenda just told Chris what she did. She did something desperate that's worse than that. She ran away from home. Back at the Anderson place after Chris had found out from this news from Brenda. So, after finding out where she is, What Brenda wanted to know from Chris if she would call a cab to take Brenda to the Anderson place. So meanwhile, the Anderson place, Chris just told Brenda that it'll take $40 for her to get there. And there's a bigger problem. She doesn't have the $40. So meanwhile, at the bus station, Brenda just told Chris if she would like to pick her up instead. But at first Chris declined, and Brenda just let slip to tell Chris that her father doesn't even realize that Brenda ran away, and he'll freak out if he found out about it. So Brenda just begs Chris to come pick her up. At first Chris declined and then told Brenda that she has her mother's car and she wasn't supposed to take it out to the city. So finally Chris agrees, but under one condition: if Brenda is not to move anywhere, and Chris promised that she'll pick up Brenda in half an hour. So after that phone call, Chris just told Brett and Sarah that she'll be gone in a while and she'll be right back. But they told her no way. And then after that debate of who's watching who and etc., that's when Sarah suggested a road trip. But Chris told her no way, and that the Ederson parents will freak out if they found out about it. But then Sarah pleads her case with Chris to say that the Ederson parents will freak out even more if they found out that Sarah's alone with Brad. Well, that convinces Chris otherwise to let Brad and Sarah tag along under one condition: that if anyone asked, they went out for ice cream. But on the way to the car, that's when Daryl shows up, and then told Chris that he wants to go along too, but at first Brad declined. But then, at first Daryl was going to let slip to Chris that he was going to tell the Andersons about her and etc. That's when Chris decides to let Daryl go along with Brad, Sarah, and herself, under one condition: if Brad and Daryl can promise to behave themselves. Otherwise, it'll be serious consequences in Chris's case. So they agreed. So after everyone left the Anderson place, it's road trip time. That was until Chris's mother's car suffered a flat tire. Luckily for Chris, she manages to pull over. As soon as Chris pulls over, she realizes that there are three problems. First of all, Chris's mother's car doesn't have a spare tire. Problem number two, Chris forgot her purse because her checkbook was inside. Problem number three, well, Chris just discovered that she was driving without a license. She didn't have any money, though Brad did have the money, but it's 50 cents. But good thing for Chris, Brad, Sarah, and Dara, they just saw a truck pulling up. But it's not just any truck, it's a tow truck. It is driven by Mr. John Pruitt himself. So Chris explains to Mr. Pruitt about how she's stuck with babysitting, she doesn't have any money, and she wasn't supposed to take them out to the city, and etc. So Mr. Pruitt, who understands Chris's situation, made a deal with her. Since he's on his way to Dawson's garage, he decided to buy a spare tire for her, in which she agrees. So everyone, including Mr. Pruitt, had boarded a tow truck to Dawson's garage. But on the way there, Mr. Pruitt gets a transmission from a CB radio from Mr. Dawson, the guy who owns the place, to tell Mr. Pruitt that he's been at the Pruitt place, and what he saw was unbelievable. Mrs. Pruitt was having an affair. Now Mr. Pruitt, understandably upset, decides to drive his tow truck over at his place. So back with John Pruitt, who had just arrived at his place, one of the first things he does is that he broke down the door, he catches his wife in the act, he punched the guy out the window, and was going to shoot at the guy, but Mrs. Pruitt wouldn't allow it, so the shot missed the guy who had an affair with her, and instead went into Chris's mom's car window. The windshield, that is. So back with Chris, Brad, and Sarah, they went out of the tow truck and into the hijacked Cadillac. You've heard right. I said hijacked, and it's about to be done by a guy named Joe Gibb. So the hijacked Cadillac left the Pruitt place. So back with Joe, who made a conversation with Chris, and he made a promise with her that he wasn't going to hurt anybody and made sure that everyone was going to be safe, or so he thought. So the hijacked Cadillac went inside the chop shop. So at the chop shop, we have two men that runs the place, Bleak and Graydon. So Graydon was the first to see the Cadillac pull up, and out comes Joe and along with Chris and the group. Then Graydon got upset with Joe, and then claims his case to say that the kids must be onto their operation somehow. Although Joe said that they had nothing to do with it, they were in trouble, and so they got into the car with him. So Bleak meanwhile tells Joe to take everybody upstairs until he decides on what to do with him after the meeting ended. So long story short, inside the shop's office, that's when Sarah tries to use the telephone, but nothing worked. Then Daryl spotted a Playboy magazine with Miss March on the cover. He decides to swipe it off the desk. Then, aha, Sarah has an escape plan, and by how? Through the hole in the ceiling. So, thanks to Sarah's escape plan, Chris went in first, and then Brad, then Sarah, then lastly Daryl. So meanwhile, at the Associate Center in downtown Chicago on the 42nd floor, there's a party going on. Mrs. Anderson had no luck reaching Chris at their place and suspected that Chris must have gone out for ice cream and along with Brad, Sarah, and Daryl. So back in the chop shop, we have Chris, Sarah, Brad, and Daryl are trying to make their escape through a window that's nearby. Down below, we have Bleak having a meeting with his men, including Graydon. So Bleak was telling Graydon to get the magazine from upstairs, and so he did. So he went upstairs to the office only to find out that the magazine was missing. So when Graydon comes downstairs, he told Bleak the bad news that the magazine's gone and so were the kids. So back with Chris and the gang who made it out the chop shop's window, that's when they were spotted in the alley by Bleak, Graydon, and Joe. So Bleak was telling Joe to bring the car around, in which he did, and that's when Bleak just let slip to Graydon that if the kids decided to turn in the magazine with the Philadelphia order inside to the police, they could go to jail for 20 years. So they had to get it back. So back with Chris and the gang, long story short, they were chased by the bad guys and into the backstage of the Silver Dollar Blues Club. And that's where Chris and the group just saw Albert Collins and his band that is playing there. However, Albert refused to let the group leave unless they sing the blues, and so they did. So after the song Babysitting Blues and it came to an end, that's when Graydon and Bleak showed up, and then also Joe. Well, luckily for Chris and the gang, they managed to escape, but not so much for the bad guys, which are Graydon, Bleak, and Joe. So, long story short, back with Brenda, who's still stuck at the bus station at the moment, that's when she got her glasses stolen and she saw what looked like a kitten, or so she thought. But the moment that she was told at the last minute that what she's picking up is a sewer rat, she screams in horror and then runs off. So long story short, back with Chris and the gang who just left the Blues Club moments ago, but so did Graydon, Bleak, and Joe who continued to pursue them until they arrived at the train station. So at the train station, that's when Chris and the gang had boarded the train to make their escape. Inside the train, that's when Chris and the gang should have realized that they weren't alone because a couple of gang members were about to kill each other when they were on their way to Devereux Street. That was until before the fight can happen, that's when Chris breaks it up. So when Chris was asking the gang's leaders if she and her group would be allowed to get off at the next stop before the fight can happen, one of the gang's leaders refused and insulted her. When Brad heard that, he tries to defend her the best way he knew how and asked one of the leaders to apologize. When he refused to apologize, that's when Brad again told the gang's leaders to watch who he was speaking with. So that led to the result of the gang's leader stabbing Brad's foot. Well, Chris agrees to threaten the gang's leaders, which allows them to let her and the group pass and get off at the next stop. Now that the gang's leaders are, however, in their case, no better than the rest with her, so Brad had to go to the hospital. So, now that Chris and the gang had arrived at the hospital, good news for one of the hospital's doctors, Brad's toe's all stitched up. Remember the two guys that had a fight at the Pruitt place? Well, they just got arrested thanks to Mrs. Pruitt who called the police on them. Well, the guy who got arrested just pleaded his case to say that his car's been stolen because of the kids. But in retrospect, it was Joel who had stolen the car. So Mr. Pruitt, who had also gotten arrested, he punched the guy. And so thanks to Mr. Pruitt, Chris and the gang had managed to make their getaway. At the hospital's parking lot, that's when John Pruitt just told Chris and the gang the good news and bad news. Well, first the good news. While at Dawson's garage, Mr. Pruitt just said that he paid for the windshield because it's his fault that it got shot. Now here comes the bad news. He just told Chris that Mr. Dawson, who owns the garage, has told Chris that as for the tire, it's going to cost $50. Now, according to Chris, after learning this situation, here's a bigger problem. How she's going to get the $50? So, thanks to Daryl, Chris and the group has spotted a frat house up ahead. Since Sarah had to use the bathroom anyway, so what Chris and the group did is that they stopped by at the frat house. So, inside the frat house, while Brad and Sarah were allowed to use the bathroom, that's when Chris and Dan had met. So, long story short, after Chris had a dance with Dan, Dan not only agrees to give Chris $50, but instead he gives her $45. So, although despite the fact of being $5 short, Dan also agrees to take Chris and the group to Dawson's garage. So, after that, they left the frat house. Later, Dan along with Chris and the group had a ride at Dawson's garage, so all Chris has to do is give Mr. Dawson the $50. So, inside Dawson's garage, that's when Chris and the gang had met up with Mr. Dawson, the guy who owns the place. Well, good news, Chris's mother's cars are now all fixed up, so what Chris did is she gave Mr. Dawson $45. But he's short of $5. But thanks to Sarah, who mistook for Thor, her favorite comic book character, that convinces Dawson otherwise. So he agrees to give Chris and the gang the keys to the car, so after that, Krista again had left Dawson's garage. So back with Graydon, Bleak, and Joe, now that they realized that Chris and the gang had already left Dawson's garage, they're now on their way to pick up Brenda. Well, speaking of Brenda, back with her, who's still stuck at a bus station, well, good news for her, she stole her own glasses back. Remember Mike who changed his plans at the last minute? Well, he's at the restaurant, but he had no idea that Chris and the gang are about to go inside the exact same restaurant as he did. So she did. And she just let slip to the group that Mike is supposed to be taking her there. And that's when, by surprise, that's when Chris sees Mike with Sesame. However, Chris was mad and enraged, and she realized that what her best friend Brenda had told her was true, that Mike had been lying to her. And so, after she got upset about it, then it was Brad's turn to stand up to Mike, but he refused to hit him. Luckily for Daryl, who's Brad's best friend, he did Brad a favor by kicking Mike in the behind instead. So after Chris broke up with Mike and everybody left the restaurant, that's when Chris and the boys realized that Sarah was missing. So back with Sarah, she's now at the window of the toy store. That was until Bleak shows up. So after Sarah saw Bleak, that's when she ran off. Back with Daryl and Brad, who's Sarah's brother, and Chris, who just found out that Sarah was just there moments ago at the toy store but then left. Back with Sarah, who just ran off earlier from Bleak, that's when she spotted the Associate Center, the one that her parents went to the party. Anyway, good news for Sarah, she went inside, got on the elevator to get away from the bad guys. Now here comes the bad news. She got off the 44th floor of the building. So back with Graydon and Bleak, who made it to the exact same Associate Center as Sarah did, they decided to split up. So Bleak gets off the 42nd floor, while Graydon gets off on the 44th floor. So back with Brad, Sarah, and Chris, they're now in the exact same Associate Center just like Sarah did, and just like Graydon and Bleak did. So now all they had to do was find Sarah. So what they did is that they got on the elevator and got off the 42nd floor first, but then they found out that's where the Andersons are having a party there. Now Chris is getting worried that they'll get caught for sure and get into trouble, but aha, Chris has a plan to disguise herself. And by how? Using one of the fur coats, of course. So long story short, after Bleak had got off the 46th floor earlier, just like what Chris and the gang did, he was approached by Mr. and Mrs. Anderson. So that gives Chris plenty of time to come up with another plan. And by how? By using the cord to tie his feet, of course. Back with Sarah, who is still on the 44th floor, who's trying to get away from Grayson. She's now on the window of the 42nd floor. So, back with Chris, after Bleak falls down flat on his face because of the cord that's tied to his feet, she just told Brad and Daryl where Sarah went, so they went to the 44th floor. So, long story short, now that everybody got off the 44th floor, well, good news for them, they managed to rescue Sarah when they did, with a little help from the rope that they used. So, when Chris and the gang were about to leave, that's when Joe shows up. And then Joe just let slip to the group of what Bleak's been after all along. It's the exact same magazine that Daryl took from the chop shop's office, the one with the Philadelphia order inside. So, when Joe was asked by Chris and the group what they should do about Graydon, well, according to Joe, he refuses to save him. Poor guy's afraid of heights. So, when Joe, along with Chris and the group, were about to leave, that's when Bleak shows up. So, when Bleak was asking Joe to hand the magazine over, instead, Joe just punched Bleak in the face. So, it's now time for Chris and the group to leave. So, at the bus station, they ended up picking up Brenda on the way. So, when Sarah found out that her skate was missing and told Chris about it, that's when Chris told Sarah that there's no time to go back for it. So, on the freeway, that's when Chris realizes that they're not the only ones who are going back to the Anderson place. The Andersons are going there too. So, what did Chris do? She did what any person would do, beat them home. So, that's what happened. So, back at the Anderson place, that's when Chris told Brad, Sarah, and Daryl to go upstairs, and so they did. After that, Chris sends her best friend Brenda home. So after Chris sends her best friend away, it's cleanup time, so she rushes to the kitchen to clean up. Long story short, the Andersons had just arrived at the residence. Back inside, back with Chris, long story short, after she finishes cleaning, she turns off the TV, then runs from the kitchen to the living room, and just in the nick of time before the Andersons can walk right into the little door. So by the time that the Andersons arrived, Mrs. Anderson went first to apologize to Chris for running late and asked if there were any problems. And Chris said no. And of course, Chris just told the Andersons the good news that Brad had just invited his best friend to sleep over. Meanwhile, in Brad's upstairs bedroom, that's when Chris told Brad, Sarah, and Daryl that first of all, the good news is that everything is under control. And second of all, also the good news that the Andersons hadn't suspected a thing. Nothing. So what Sarah wanted to know from Chris is she can do it again the following week. Although Chris says that she's not making any promises with Sarah, but said that she'll see what she can do. Daryl, however, went next to thank Chris for the night he'll never forget, and as for Brad, he agrees to remain friends with Chris, which she was okay with. So back with Chris after leaving Brad's bedroom, she gets a thanks from the Andersons and then leaves the residence. But before heading off, that's when Dan shows up, and he told her the good news that he's returning the missing skate that Sarah left behind in his Jeep by accident. So that's the good news. So Chris was asking Dan if she can return the $45 that she borrowed, but Dan tells her that it wasn't necessary. As the film comes to an end, that's when Dan was asking Chris if he would hire her as a babysitter. At first, Chris tells him that she's pretty much retired, but then she had a second thought. So, Chris and Dan not only ended up together, but, even better, they hooked up with a kiss.